Thanks for joining us. Wow, we had about 5,000 people register for this, and as you heard, we're streaming it in a few places. We have about 1,000 people here at the capacity of Zoom, and thanks for the rest of you tuning in on LinkedIn or YouTube. I think, Brad, maybe we touched a nerve with this topic, the idea of building thriving startup communities, something you're super familiar with, and of course we are too at Techstars. And I want to just set up the conversation, the framing. We are doing this in two parts. This is the first part where we're really going to dig into what makes a thriving startup community and everything that we've learned together and that you've written extensively about over the years. And then in the second one, we're going to dive more into a new Techstars product that we're bringing to market this quarter, right now, actually. And maybe in the second in the series next week, we'll hear from some of the people that we're partnering with on the new product. It's called a Techstars Startup Community Partnership, along the lines of all the great work that you've done, Brad, and that we've done over the years at Techstars. One of the things we noticed is that we only really had one way as Techstars to help people who are building their startup community develop their local community, and that was by having a Techstars accelerator in their community. So of course we do that in 13 countries and 40 different locations today, but the problem with that for most places in the world, most cities, is it takes a lot of readiness, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of capital to support a Techstars accelerator program year after year after year. And for most startup communities, a Techstars accelerator isn't attainable, or it's just not a great place to start given where they are in their development. So we're really excited to be launching this new product suite at Techstars this quarter called the Startup Community Partnership, where it'll give us more ways to engage with more startup communities around the world and more potential to bring the power of the Techstars network to your city. And that'll mean more places can be Techstars nodes on our network starting this year. So we're pretty excited about that. We're going to talk about that a little bit at the end and more in the second webinar next week. But today we really want to focus on our time with Brad. Brad, for maybe the 1% of people out there of the 5,000 listening that don't know you, Brad, let's start with a quick, just 1 or 2 minute background on who you are and your experience.
Sure. I have been many of the things I think that people on this call have been. So I started a long time ago as somebody in their late teens, early 20s as an entrepreneur. I co-founded a company with a partner. We sold that company to a public company in the early 1990s. I was CTO of that public company for a year or so. During that period of time, in the mid-1990s, I started making angel investments with the money that I made from selling that first company. Over a 3-year period, I made about 40 angel investments, which translated into about one investment a month, which today is not that unusual, but in the mid-90s was considered insane. Most angel investors maybe made 1 or 2 investments a year. So that was kind of an odd thing, but it was part of what developed my own view of how to think about really early stage investing at the pre-seed, seed angel level. In 1996 and 1997, I accidentally became a VC. I connected with a group, again, while I was making my own investments, I connected with a group that was at the time a not very well-known Japanese company called SoftBank that was starting to do a lot of investments in digital media, what became known as the internet in the US. And I was part of the team that did all the US investing for SoftBank in that era. I enjoyed the rise up of the internet bubble and the hard crash of it. I also co-founded a couple more companies during that period of time, a few that were very successful and a few that were not. In 2006, I co-founded with David Brown, and Jared Polis Techstars in Boulder with this idea of doing angel investing, or it wasn't called pre-seed then, but very, very early stage investing in a different way, vision that David had, and supported that. And in 2007, I co-founded a Foundry group with 3 other partners. And that's the venture capital firm that I've been part of since then. I've also, going back to the late 90s, invested in other early stage venture funds Personally, probably over 100 funds over that period of time that I've been an LP in. And then Foundry in 2016 started investing institutionally in other venture funds, and we've invested in about 50 other venture funds through Foundry. So spent a lot of time in and around everything entrepreneur and founder related. That's essentially been the work that I've done over the course of my life. Last comment of things that I've done. Some of you may know I've written a bunch of books, almost all of them around business and entrepreneurship. And my wife, Amy Batchelor, and I also run a foundation of ours called Anchor Point Foundation. And one of the focus areas we've had is entrepreneurship and funding different initiatives that are similar in a lot of ways to the kinds of initiatives that the Techstars Foundation has funded over the years.
Thanks, Brad. And maybe if you don't know me super well, I'm obviously co-founded Techstars with Brad. Been here since the very beginning, which amazingly is now about 18 years. Yep, I said 18. That's crazy. We're out of the awkward teenage years. We're now into adulthood, which is super cool. And my claim to fame is basically founding Techstars with Brad. So now you know enough about me. I came back as CEO about 9 months ago after 4 years as chairman, and so I'm back actively in the seat running the company again. And one of the changes we're making is this startup community partnership that I mentioned. But Brad, again, want to get into your books. You've written a couple of books. These are the books, those ones there. Some of them that you've written, Startup Communities, the Startup Community Way. And in those books, you talk about something called the Boulder thesis. And I think it'd be interesting for people to hear, how is Boulder different than it was 18 years ago when, Techstars and Foundry were being born here? There had been a lot of work done, but how has it changed in that 18-year period, and why do you think it's changed?
I want to focus on one word, which is founder. And I think the essence of the evolution is everything orienting around that word. So in 2006, when we started Techstars, there was entrepreneurial activity and there were companies being created and there were founders in Boulder. I moved to Boulder in 1995 from Boston. The reason Amy and I ended up in Boulder is she told me she was moving to Boulder and I could come with her if I wanted to. We did happen to be married at the time, so it was a pretty easy choice. But I had been living, or the two of us had been living in Boston for 12 years and had a great time in Boston, and Boston was very good to us, but it wasn't home. So from 95 to 2006, I was part of being an angel investor, being an investor, and then being a VC investor in companies in and around Boulder, but also across the United States, because my network was national. A lot of stuff on the East Coast, a lot of stuff on the West Coast, and not just Bay Area companies, but LA, Southern California, San Diego, Seattle, Boston, New York. But I grew up in Dallas, Texas, so I had some investments in Dallas and on and on. So I had a pretty broad perspective on what was going on. And it's important to realize Boulder itself is a small town. It's 100,000 people. Denver, which is about 45-minute drive from Boulder, is 2 million people. So the dynamics of Boulder and Denver, sort of think of, binary stars that are next to each other, near each other with some gravitational focus, but one's really tiny and one's really big. What happened in that time period, sort of around 1995 to 2006, was the ecosystem, broadly writ, was controlled by a handful of folks. And the handful of folks included some VC investors, university. There's always some government activity around it. And the founders themselves were very diffuse. They knew each other, and there were a lot of friendships, but there wasn't a lot of things that held them together. There wasn't a lot of stuff that engaged them with each other in a continual way. Interestingly, though, all of them were fiercely, fiercely loyal to Boulder. They loved Boulder. They loved their town. And it's a word that you'll see come up in some of my books called topophilia. I got the word from John Hickenlooper, who was governor of Colorado for a number of years and is now one of Colorado's 2 senators. And this love of place was really foundational. And Amy and I fell in love with Boulder, and Boulder was our place. In 2006, we were still on the back end of the collapse of the internet bubble and tech broadly and entrepreneurship. 2002 to 2005 was really miserable. There was a Forbes article that's very famous called "The Death of Silicon Valley," and like there was a sign with an exit, like a highway of the economy, and exit right for Silicon Valley. It was just a mess still in 2006. Although it was starting to come back, there were companies being founded again. Founders were kind of back thinking about what they were going to do next. But Boulder had become even more diffuse, and there was really no central core. There were no activities for people to engage with. Hence Techstars, and then a really powerful experience in Boulder over probably the next decade, where it shifted, where all of a sudden by mid 2000 teens, 2014, 2015, the heart of everything around entrepreneurship was founder driven. And not only was it founder driven in Boulder, but it had extended to Denver. The two communities had connected, and the energy between the founders driving new company creation and all of the activity, innovation, economic growth had shifted and had become completely founder centric, supported by all of the other actors in the community, government, university, large companies, et cetera. So that's really the shift. And when I think 18 years later, one of my early premises was that you don't want to hang on as a leader. You want to nurture and develop, and then get out of the way for the next generation of leaders in the startup community. I talk about that over and over again. And I'm a good example of somebody who was a leader for many years in the Boulder startup community. And there was a moment in time, 5 or 6 years ago, where I realized happily, joyfully, that there were a number of other people in the Boulder startup community and the Denver startup community that were the leaders now, and that I was supporting and helping and participating with and still doing things, but no longer sort of viewed as the leader driving. So that evolution has been profound. Last thing I'll say about it is it feels sustainably durable. There have been lots of up and downs along the way. Of course, there's a global financial crisis. Of course, we had COVID. There was a long stretch of time, where there was a huge amount of upward activity around funding and founders and startups, but there's also been a bunch of flat spots where things sort of felt like they slowed down or things changed. All of that's normal in any sort of ecosystem, and we may talk about ecosystems versus communities later. But the robustness of it that's oriented around founders, and then interestingly, another category, I talk about leaders, but another category of participants who are leaders, who in the startup community way I call instigators. Those leaders and instigators really became and today are the core of the activity going forward.
Yeah, and having been here, I think I moved here the same year you did to Boulder, and uh, the difference today is pretty incredible. And you always talk in your books and talks I've heard about taking a 20-year view. We're almost there, right? In the 20-year view from my Techstars perspective, but you've been at it even longer than that. And I think that just the generation change that you're talking about. Like I go to we do a regular happy hour for people that have moved here or are trying to connect to the community here that don't know how to do that. And I still go to those. Like I maybe go to every other one, but there's 10 other people that are leading those and organizing those and making them happen. So that has been a really profound shift, and as you said, does feel really durable. So all these experiences that you had, Brad, and probably in Boulder, but in many other places, and sort of being a co-founder of Techstars and seeing us, grow around the world and do what we do, sort of led you to, I think, the trying to capture the ideas of this in the books that you wrote. So at a high level, talk about a little bit about the two books on startup communities and what were you trying to accomplish by writing them?
So the first book, which was just called Startup Communities, and I think the subtitle was Building an Entrepreneurial Ecosystem in Your City. And I was deliberate. I was deliberate at the time. The phrase entrepreneurial ecosystem kind of existed. It was an academic and government construct. You'd see it sort of floating around. You'd also heard about innovation, economy, and things like that. The phrase startup communities did not exist. And I was looking for a phrase when I wrote the book that forced people to think differently about what was going on. And I really wanted to juxtapose startup community and entrepreneurial ecosystem. Interestingly, of course, a lot of people then called things startup ecosystems or entrepreneurial communities. So like there's the evolution of that. But I started writing the book in 2010 and it came out in 2012. 2010, if you remember, I think probably everybody here was alive in 2010. I don't know what age people were. But it was the tail end of the global financial crisis. And in 2008, when the global financial crisis, 8 and 9, when it was really happening, the world was going to end. Capitalism was going to end. Societies were all going to become owned by government. Banks were all going to become nationalized. I mean, it was really a traumatic time from a macroeconomic perspective. And what started at the tail end of it to happen was there was a lot, even though the global financial crisis had been this intense thing, there was a lot of startups that were created during this period of time. And a number of startups that are the big ones that we talk about, some of the big ones we talk about today, like, for example, Facebook, LinkedIn would be another part of Microsoft, obviously now, really accelerated their growth in that period of time, became pretty substantial businesses. And coming out of 2010, people were starting to talk about innovation and entrepreneurship again. And places that were now being talked about as in the US for that included, the Bay Area or Silicon Valley, New York, Boston, and then Boulder would show up. And Boulder didn't really belong in that list. It was not anywhere close in terms of scale of those places, but the magnitude of companies per capita in Boulder was off the charts. And so for a small 100,000 person town, the number of startups that were being created and the activity around that was really dramatic. So in that first book, I tried to describe, not tell the story of Boulder, but I tried to describe what had happened using Boulder as the story for creating a framework. And the very simple part of the framework is Boulder thesis. In the second book, which I wrote with Ian Hathaway, that came out in 2020, right in the middle of COVID, and we'd really started writing in 2018. In that book, what we tried to do was both fix a bunch of the things in that first book that weren't quite right or were just blatantly wrong about how government could engage, about how large companies could engage, about how these things evolved, but also try to put a framework on top of this phenomena called a startup community about how it really does evolve as ecosystems and communities, using an ecological word, evolve. And in the context of it, and I'll sort of footnote and come back to it, sort of this notion of a network and this notion of evolution and the importance of it not being a defined path where you start on point A and you define what the outcome is at the end, and you go from point A to the end. In that second book, the real insight was, just like a company, any of you are founders of companies, you don't start on day one and saying, this is what the end point of the company is going to be. You start, you have a hypothesis, you run an experiment. Some of those experiments succeed. Many of them fail. A lot of them don't work. But you learn from the experiment that doesn't work. And when you learn from the experiment that doesn't work, you make a new hypothesis and you try again. And when it works, you do more of that. And what Ian and I really sort of tried to organize in this book was this idea that the outputs of the experiments become the inputs for the new things in your evolution. And so the second book's more abstract. It's a little more intellectual than the first book, but it has a lot of examples also of other startup communities around the world that had grown between 2012 and 2020. Many of the experiences that David and I had with places where Techstars was, but plenty where we learned from where Techstars wasn't.
So at a high level, that's what the books are about. And I see some questions rolling through, we need more practical information about how to actually build a thriving startup community. Yeah, I mean, that's what you tried to do in those books, right? Is both from kind of the more scientific, how does it really work as a ecosystem, right? In startup community way, but Startup Community's book is still really the sort of first one to read, I think, for most people.
Absolutely. Well, I'll be prescriptive and responsive to that question. So in the startup community book, I came out with, I oriented the entire book around this notion that I describe as the Boulder thesis. And at the time, today some of these ideas will seem normal and commonplace, and they're the language that people are using, which is awesome. In 2012, this was a new set of ideas, new way of thinking about things. So it's important with the historical reference of 15 or so years of it being different. The Boulder thesis had four principles, and they were simple, and that was important because it needed to be an easy thing to grab onto. Number one is that the founders have to be the leaders of the startup community. Interestingly, in the book, I think the first principle is entrepreneurs have to be the leaders. And over time, I shifted from using the word entrepreneur to using the word founder, because the word entrepreneur it's not what it is. Like, founders are different. All of a sudden, everybody became an entrepreneur. I'm in a big company and I'm an entrepreneur. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a this. I'm a that. Versus founder being very, very well defined what a founder was. The founders have to be the leaders of the startup community. Full stop. Second, you have to take a long-term view. I wanted to say you have to take a view forever. My publisher, who was helpful with that book and tightening a few things up, said you can't do that. People won't understand that. It's too abstract. And so I said, all right, a generational view, 20 years. You have to have a 20-year view. And over time, I started to say you have to have a 20-year view from today. So every day your view resets and you're still looking out 20 years. So 5 years from now, you're still looking out 20 years. So you're really taking a long view of what you're trying to do in your startup community. Third is that you have to be inclusive of anyone who wants to engage. I saw this in a lot of different places where, oh, you don't have the right degree. Oh, you don't have enough experience. Oh, you work for a big company. Oh, you work for the government. Oh, you know, didn't finish college. Oh, have never been in a successful company. Oh, you've never started a successful company. And sort of my view was, no, anyone who wants to engage in the startup community should be welcome, and the startup community should be inclusive. And the dynamic of the startup community, and I talk a fair amount about how that over time can be very, very powerful. Last is that you have to take a long-term view around having continuous activities and events that engaged people in entrepreneurship. So many of the things that I had been involved in the 90s and the first decade of the 21st century that had something to do around entrepreneurship were either awards, cocktail parties, meet and greet things that were kind of like networking events that were kind of unspecified what they were. And a lot of them, were hard to access. They would cost money that founders didn't have. They were held at times that were inconvenient for people that had kids and families. They were in places that were, too expensive, or they were just frankly boring, not interesting, didn't do anything. And by this point at Techstars, we'd had the experience of startup weekends and startup week and a number of other activities that had been created in Boulder and other places. The meetup phenomena around the topic, and the idea of using that to engage in entrepreneurial activity. And the reference point for me here was actually the Bay Area, where if you went to the Bay Area, there was a super saturation of things to do around entrepreneurship. Like every day you could find some kind of event to participate in. there became a point by about, I don't know, David, you might remember the date, but 2015, where in Boulder, that super saturation had happened. Like you couldn't go to everything because every night there were two or three things. In the afternoon, there were things. There were week-long events all the time. Like that super saturation of activity and events around entrepreneurship was key. So those were the four principles. Founders have to be the leaders. You have to have a long-term view. You have to be inclusive of anyone who wants to engage. You have to have activities and events that engage the entire startup community on a continual basis. And then, of course, much more depth in how to think about that in the book with examples. And then the second book, Startup Community Way, Ian and I sort of even went a level deeper in terms of giving ways to think about that and structure around that.
So encourage people to dig into those books and dig into those four. It's certainly been our experience with Techstars and building it and all these different communities around the world that, you know, taking these attitudes, these approaches, this rhythm of events, this inviting everyone inclusively, this has been a really powerful thing for all the startup communities we've been involved in. Brad, when you think about, you know, maybe there's folks watching here that have been working on their startup community for a long time and feeling maybe a little frustrated, right? It's not thriving yet. It's not growing the way I want. What do you think maybe separates, you know, a community that's struggling to grow or to see more activity from one that's really thriving? What do you think is really the thing they should focus on, you know, from the books or from your experience?
Yeah, probably a couple of things, and I'll start. And the older people in the audience will understand this reference, and if you don't understand this reference, I encourage you to go on YouTube at some point and search for Steve Ballmer, developers, developers, developers. There's a very, very famous video clip of Steve Ballmer at Microsoft's heyday with software developers and development tools, sort of pre-current Microsoft. And Ballmer is jumping around on stage, sweating profusely, screaming, developers, 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 developers. Like it's just this crazy chant. Nerd cringeworthy at its extreme in a wonderful way. And my equivalent of that for a thriving startup community is the word network, right? If you are jumping around saying network, 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 not having cocktail parties, but feeling like you've got all of these network linkages between all of the participants in the startup community, and that your startup community is simply another node on a network of other startup communities in other geographies, and that you have connectivity to those other nodes. And that network is an evolving organism, constantly growing, changing, as companies come and go, as people come and go. There was a thing in the very early 2010 timeframe, 2011 timeframe, in the not thriving dynamic, where there was a lot of we must keep people in our city. And you see the zero sum thinking, especially with headquarters and large Fortune 1000 companies, where one city is providing a whole bunch of financial incentives to companies to come to their city and create headquarters, and theoretically it creates jobs and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But this notion in the context of founders and startups is input output. You want people coming to your city and you want people leaving your city, because the phenomena of that network is not a localized network. It has to be a really powerful localized core, but you want that network effect to be geographically distributed, especially when you look at tech and companies that are really, the customers are global. They're all over the place. Employees might be all over the place because you might be distributed. And so, what are the different places that you're engaged with? So that's sort of in the positive. If you find the insularness, that's stifling. Zero sum thinking against one geography that's adjacent to another. Boulder, Denver is a great example of this. Like if there's zero sum thinking where Boulder wins and Denver loses, that's just stupid. Boulder and Denver both win when Boulder wins or Denver wins. And this idea that, this geographic effect of localized geography, very powerful. I mean, Toronto Waterloo is another great example. I think Waterloo is roughly the same distance from Toronto. I think the relative sizes of the two cities, maybe Toronto's bigger than Denver, but maybe the relative sizes are about the same. When one wins, the other wins. Like that's a win positive for both. And that's true over and over and over. And if you look at places like large geographies, like um, uh, the LA region, which somebody once told me is like 68 cities or something like that. Or what's called Silicon Valley, which if you start, in the north of the city up in Marin and go through the city and go all the way down to San Jose, that's a big piece of geography in a lot of different places. You can say, well, Menlo Park wins when Palo Alto loses. That's dumb. Um, the peninsula wins when San Francisco loses. By the way, that's dumb. And on and on and on. Like, that that mentality is bad. And then maybe the last is this idea of control. No one should control top down the startup community. It's a bottom up phenomenon. It's this evolving, growing thing. So when a university in a city tries to control what's going on, not good. That'll stagnate things. When government tries to control, or a big company tries to control, or frankly, a powerful investor tries to control, use me as an example. In Boulder, I was a powerful investor. And Foundry was a powerful investment firm relative to everything else. But we didn't try to control anything. We tried to support and help and engage. And when a company that we weren't investors in was successful, that was awesome. That wasn't a problem for us. I mean, we might look at each other and say, well, we should have invested in that one. That's us. That's not bad company. It's like great that that company's working. So it's this idea of trying to control things. When you see that among any of the actors, that's a problem.
Thanks. Yeah, and you mentioned LA. Shout out to our friends in LA, going through a lot. Thanks for being here. Um, I think when we think about what we're doing here at Techstars, it really what you talked about with the nodes and the network early in your answer really, I think, resonated because I think what we've seen is we have this group of places where we operate, and there is, a lot of tightness between them, a lot of sharing of opportunities, investments, talent, between those communities. And those communities individually are amazing, vibrant nodes, right? Where there's lots of great activity happening in places like Boston and LA and, London and Berlin and beyond. But we're not doing that everywhere. And you can sense on this call, if you sort of monitor at all the chat going on, a need to connect, a need to learn from each other, a need to, sort of participate as a group. And people are, setting little side things to talk about it in their state or whatever. But there's so much to learn from each other. And I think that, Techstars can play a bit of a convening role in that sense. And I feel like we're doing that a little bit today because you and I, Brad, and everyone at Techstars, we care a lot about all the startup communities all over the world. Like the fact that Boulder is 100,000 people and punches way above its weight means that anywhere can do that in the world, right? And it's like you said, focusing on founders, founders, founders. So, we're thinking about this new product, Startup Community Partnership, that I mentioned earlier, is really about how do we put more nodes on the network, right? We don't have to have a 10 or $20 million capital commitment somewhere to put a node on the network. We can have a Techstars person in another town that has 100,000 people or 1 million people that, that city wants to grow, that city wants to connect, that city wants to bring their, stuff, right? Their founders, their investors, their mentors to a broader network. They want that broader network to come to them. They want to be able to, create opportunities for our companies in their community. They want to create more founders in their community. They want to give more opportunities to those founders. So that's what we're building is this idea of a startup community partnership, which is a much more lightweight way to engage with Techstars, to convene this amazing global community, to learn from each other, to have the brand right in your city, to connect it to this amazing network. So I know you've been really involved in helping us think about that based on all your work, but that's sort of where we're going with it. We're going to talk a lot more about what that product is and how we can convene people, how we can bring Techstars to your city, right, to do more with you and grow over time rather than having to start with this really, complex accelerator that takes a lot of capital and all of that. There's a lot more that I think we can do with this network to help these cities succeed. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that product or where we're trying to take it.
Well, I'll give an example that, was a profound one for me probably 15 years ago, early on in Techstars, after we had started to expand into other cities. So I think we had expanded to 4 cities at the time. So we had Boulder, Boston, Seattle, and New York. And so we had accelerator programs in each geo. We had mentors in each location. Some of the mentors mentored in multiple locations, but a lot of the mentors were local. And I'd already had this experience with Foundry and with our network and our investments because we had, founders in different cities and companies in different cities. And, we could call on somebody in, a company in New York in ad tech to help with something that was going on with a company in Seattle that had something to do with ad tech and some overlap in that domain. So like that, I was ready for that idea. And what I saw happen very quickly was a couple of mentors that were in geography A started to help companies in geography B, got connected to other mentors in geography B, then started showing up as investors because they were mentors and investors in that geography because all of a sudden their network connected. And so they got help in that geography. And I'm thinking specifically of Boston to Seattle. And then it reversed where all of a sudden that network was between somebody in Boston who was a mentor who was very active, another mentor in Seattle who was very active, an investor in Boston, an angel investor who was also a mentor, that all of a sudden started investing in the Seattle companies as an angel investor and got into that network. And it was just very early. So it was, I could see it. It wasn't sort of lost in the activity. And for me, it was unusual. It was unusual for an angel in a geography on one side of the country to suddenly be actively engaging with startups on the other side of the country. And my response was, that's the network in action.
Yep.
And we wove that collectively. I mean, my own investing activity took advantage of that in a significant way. I think Techstars wove that into the fabric of what we did. But almost by definition, our network at Techstars was limited to where there were accelerators. And with the benefit of looking backwards, um, uh, that was an inhibitor to the growth and development of the network. Now we have lots of people that engaged with Techstars that were not in cities where there were accelerators, but that was through other reasons, or maybe they moved to another place where there wasn't an accelerator and already had a connection with Techstars and da 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 da. Activating that network so that everybody that was connected could have access to everybody else that was connected in a frictionless way to help with their local startup community, to help with their local activity. We didn't do that until now. Like, I think
That's
that's
what's
the
so exciting,
government.
right? Because it's not just bring the power of the Techstars network and all the founders and the tens of thousands of investors and all that to bear on your community, but it's the network is more powerful because you're going to be able to be part of it. And I think that's really what a network is, right? Is finding the right way to engage with more nodes, getting more throughput across those nodes on the network, right? More conversations going, more connections, more founders learning, more investors, finding opportunities, not just where they are, but across a more vibrant and thriving global network. So you'll hear more about startup community partnerships and again, part two of this webinar. If you're here and you got this invite, you'll get the invite to the next one. Just it's next week. Keep your email eyes open. You'll see that. Hope you can join us for that. We're going to take some Q&A. We want to hear from you about building vibrant startup communities. And Andrea is going to come help us maybe take a few questions from you all.
All right. We had so many questions, so we're not going to get to everyone's questions, so I apologize. The first one is from LinkedIn, from Leon. Do you have any practical tips for managing and engaging a hybrid startup community of around 70 startups from 25 nationalities? Most are based in Lisbon, and we use Slack as our primary communications tool.
I have a couple of quick comments. One is I think, if you have everybody wired and engaged online already, that's a great starting point. I have a philosophy around this, which is what I call least common denominator communication, which is over time, if you look as networks grow, least common denominator actually is persistent. Um, that means that you need to make sure that you're at least email enabled in terms of all that communication. Email is the least common denominator. But if people are active and it's vibrant, that's great. I think making sure people have convening places can get together, and when they are near each other, are welcoming for people to work out of each other's offices, to see each other face to face in functional ways. I think that's a big, powerful part of it when you're, hybrid and there's distributed dynamics, especially in a world of virtual. I think it's a combination of both. And come back to this notion of activities and events. If all you're doing is communicating about things that are going on or trying to help each other with question and answer type stuff, that's helpful, but it's kind of stale. It's kind of one layer. You need to be building the muscle around different things that you're doing with startups. So I'll use a contemporary example today. There's an enormous amount of noise around AI. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on, but there's also just a lot of BS. And there's a lot of things that are interesting and working, and there's a lot of things that are, like if you read stuff, you might, that's going to mess up my world, or I've got to do something with that, or, that's going to create something that's going to exterminate the human race. From a functional perspective, as a founder, talking to other founders about what they're doing, seeing what they're doing, spending time together, sort of digging into it, is really powerful. Just saying I'm doing this, will you play with my software, whatever, not as useful, or just expressing opinion, not as useful. Last comment on it is this is part of this notion of inclusivity. I have seen long-term friendships and development develop between people who previously didn't know each other, and from a functional perspective, might not have been friends. Very, very different cultural norms, very, very different behavioral norms. Maybe they worked for competing companies prior to starting their companies. Maybe they were part of, second or third degree related to something that had conflict. Maybe they heard something somebody else said that they thought was stupid. Maybe they had biases that they brought into the conversation. Like in the startup community, trying to figure out how to engage around entrepreneurship and creating companies and not worry about that stuff, all of a sudden it generates different kind of relationships that can be very, very powerful and again, allow that evolution to happen.
Net, it's building the human relationships, right? Not just online. And while we're talking about that, Brad and I both really appreciate all the AIs that are listening in. We know
Please don't
that
kill me.
you play an important role. We respect you. Please don't kill us. Thank you.
I've been saying since 2010 that the machines have already taken over, and I just want to be nice to you, machines. Like machines, I like you. You're my friends.
All right, next question. This is from YouTube. It's easy to host events in a new community and get would-be founders together, but can it be successful without a deep base of local investors?
Absolutely, yes. One of the things that we learned in Boulder in 2007 was there was not really an angel investing, local investing infrastructure. I made some investments with my own money. David made some investments with his own money. Some other people made some invest their own money, but there just wasn't a lot of it.
5, maybe. Yeah.
No number, but small. And in some ways, the startup community trained people locally to be investors. So I'll give an example from another community where I gave a talk that the same question came up. I can't remember the year it was. The conference was called Big Omaha. And I was in Omaha, Nebraska, and they were doing an interview and fireside chat. And we did our fireside chat. And, at the end of it, people did Q&A. And somebody in the back of the audience, 500 people in the audience, back of the audience got up and said, "That's all nice, Brad. Great. Sounds wonderful. But here in Omaha, we don't have any angel investors. And so we can't get our companies funded." And, it was not woe is me, but it was some version of that. Like, how do we solve that problem? And I said, "I'm in Omaha, right? Are there any rich people in Omaha?" I think Omaha on a per capita basis is on a dollar per capita basis, one of the richest cities in the US. I don't know anymore, but it was at one point in time. Yeah, Warren Buffett and all of the people that invested in Warren Buffett in 1960 that are all now, in Kiewit and on and on and on. Huge amounts of wealth in Omaha. Beautiful. They had just redone the riverfront when I was there. Beautiful riverfront. That was real estate development thing, all that. And I said, "Look, I don't know if Warren Buffett will ever invest in a startup. That's not what I'm saying. Don't go camp out on his door. But there's a lot of wealth in this community, and this community cares. This city cares about this city. Omaha people that are wealthy care about Omaha. And one of the things that they're doing with their money is they're investing in the arts community, they're investing in the riverfront, they're investing in real estate and building out, the social infrastructure of their city. As founders, you need to help educate them on the importance of the innovation as a core part of their city. Like, for a city to be healthy and vibrant long term, you have to be creating new companies. Cities didn't just mythically exist out of nothing, right? They exist in a geography for a reason based on natural resources. Two rivers connect, or a giant body of water, or great agricultural environment or whatever. And people created businesses. Those businesses created wealth over generation one, generation two, generation three. But you got to keep doing that. Like, if all you're doing is living off of whatever was 50 years ago, your city's going to decline. And there's plenty of those stories. So it's training your local community on both why startups are important and why angel investing is so powerful, and building that again with a long-term view. It takes a while. Didn't happen overnight in Boulder, where all of a sudden everybody was an angel investor. But let me tell you have a couple of successful companies and people make 50, 100 times their money on something. Like, whoa, like, that was good. I can do a lot more of that, even if a whole bunch of them are zeros. I understand. I don't have to, make 11% IRR on my investments anymore.
That's right. Yeah, everywhere you go, you hear people talk about, there's not enough capital, right? But there is enough capital. It's just not focused on this opportunity. And so we need to create when Brad talks about training, it's not like sit in a classroom. It's tell the stories, show the examples, involve the people. And I think they realize that there's an opportunity over time. And the leaders in those communities, who are the founders, right? They're the ones that can tell the stories, educate, bring more people into the network, connect that network more globally. So I think it's a totally solvable problem most places. Plenty of money, just not going where we want it to go in the startup community.
Great. Next question from LinkedIn. What is the best way to collaborate with university relationships in order to mutually benefit with our startup community?
For the person that asked that question, there's 2 chapters in the first Startup Communities book, just called Startup Communities, that talks about this and what happened in Boulder at CU Boulder. And that was really driven by 2 people at the university, Phil Weiser and Brad Bernthal. Ironically, or entertainingly, they were both in the law school. Phil ended up at some point being dean of the law school. He's now attorney general of Colorado. And Brad's a tenured professor. But within the law school, both of them became interested in entrepreneurship. And that wasn't so weird to me, because my first company was acquired by a public company, and the co-founders of that company, which was a tech company, were both lawyers. And so they had legal training before they had become founders of a tech company. So it's kind of an interesting, like, okay, this is different. And I talk very extensively in that book about how to turn things inside out. And that's what Phil and Brad did. So instead of trying to control what was happening around entrepreneurship at the university through technology transfer office, through, structured top-down things that were happening, they did the inverse. They made the university be a convening place for founders. They made it easy to get access across the university to different things that were happening in different places with students who were interested in entrepreneurship, which then got professors and other people in the university who are interested in entrepreneurship engaged. So I used this word controlling earlier. It was not a top-down controlling phenomenon. It was much more of a bottom-up thing. And it really instantiated itself in a pretty cool way with the creation of a couple of things, again, 2010, 2012 timeframe. One was something called the Entrepreneurial Law Clinic, which essentially gave free legal services to startups. But really what it did was it got a whole bunch of second and third year law students involved in the startup community and really cross-fertilized it, which then led into the MBA program where a bunch of the MBA students cross-fertilized. And then, a bunch of these students started thinking, well, when I graduate, I can start a company or I can get involved in a startup. So like that activity started to happen at the student level. Interestingly, the lessons from that are not that dissimilar to the lessons you see from Stanford and MIT. I went to MIT, so I understood the MIT dynamics really well, and was involved in things over a long period of time there. And again, nuanced differences, but really like the core energy coming from students and professors rather than the administration trying to create structured stuff, bottom up evolution, including everybody, and really using the resources of the university in a powerful way as a convening force. It takes time because the incentives are different. People in different organizations have different motivations. That's natural. One of the things I've got wrong in the first book that I included in the second book, and then the second edition of the first book, I went and added it back in, was this notion of an instigator. And I would label Phil and Brad Bernthal instigators. So they were not founders and they worked for the university, but they were instigators in the startup community. They played the same leadership role that founders played. And by being an instigator that behaves like a founder, it's very, very powerful. And it gives a way and language and voice to people who are not founders, but who are playing the leadership role or a leadership role in the startup community. It's very, very powerful in that construct.
Great. So everybody get the book, read the chapter. For a lot of people on this call, a lot of people are from the continent of Africa. And we have somebody specifically that's based in South Africa. And they're wondering, startup funding is just about existent here. How do we build a startup community that can deliver impact without the traditional funding models?
You have a couple of comments there. One is that traditional funding is a misnomer. And I really encourage founders not to think about traditional funding as the classical example. My first company didn't raise any money. We built a successful company that was the language today is bootstrapped. We didn't have language for it then. We just said, we don't have any money, so we got to go build a business, and our source of our financing is going to be customers that pay us money to do a thing. And we did that from the very beginning. So that's like one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is the venture-backed company that raises billions of dollars of investment capital to build themselves. Like there's an enormous spectrum of types of funding sources in between those two. And those funding sources vary dramatically by geography, not just at a country level, but a region level, a city level, a community level. So I really encourage this notion of, again, going back to this long view. If the traditional funding sources, which maybe are viewed as equity, VC angel is not as prevalent or not prevalent in the geography, look for other ways, including customers, to start to build value in terms of the startup. But again, take that long view. It's not something that you do overnight. Another part of this, which I always found very interesting, is if you take a long view, and you have, go back to that word topophilia, where you have love of place, recycling capital in the community is very powerful. So as companies are successful and generate returns for the founders of those companies, those founders become the early investors in the next generation of company. And of course, that takes time. It takes 5-10 years, but you can build that in early. And there's always early wins or surprising outcomes. And so helping each other with that, and go back to this notion of a zero-sum game. If somebody attracts financing from an external resource, whether it's angel or VC or some kind of government organization that's funding economic development in a region or whatever, not holding on to that as a proprietary thing, but trying to help that entity learn more about what's going on in your startup community with other companies and other founders so that that can spread around.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brad. Thank you, David. And thank you guys all for coming to today's webinar. Sorry we couldn't get to all your questions. Please join us on February 6th for the second part of this webinar series. David Cohen and Ryan Spillane will chat with you about how to do startup community partnerships and how they actually work and how to do them with us. If you're interested now already in talking about it, there's a form that's been dropped multiple times, and we will share the recording from today's event as well. Have a fantastic day, everybody.